Two disciples praised their work and then stiffened when a subtle sound reached them. One peered through a gap and furrowed his brow. A suggestion to take another route passed between them, hesitant and low. Curiosity pushed them toward the courtyard. There they found a lone figure standing motionless, drenched and still beneath pale light. The patrol froze and recoiled. An uneasy silence fell as watches tightened around the compound. Night cloaked the lower halls as young trainee carried the council's orders. Two young trainee moved down a dim corridor and froze at a faint sound. One peered through a gap and frowned. Curiosity led them toward the courtyard, where a lone monk stood drenched beneath the pale light. They whispered and recognized him as the monk punished in the discipline court. They traded shocked guesses about the beating he must have suffered. His face then shifted into a hard glare. The patrol recoiled and tightened their watch as unease spread through the compound. The trainees pressed closer around the drenched monk as they debated immediate action. Whispers suggested notifying the discipline court, while others feared provoking the punished man. He stood rigid beneath the pale light and ignored their shocked faces. Text boxes then recounted sealed medical records and mandated punishment in clinical language. They read that harsh training had destroyed his knees and left him dependent on pain. Despite the harm, the monk accepted his fate and displayed no plea or anger. The trainees traded guilty looks and prepared to report, while he remained indifferent. The trainees clustered and argued over whether to report the wounded monk. They read sealed medical notes that described destroyed knees and mandated punishment. The monk did not beg and accepted his fate without complaint. Then someone named Mu Jin was spoken aloud, and a scarred, bare-chested figure stepped forward. Observers noted his wounds and his steady posture. A senior announced he would teach Mu Jin in the Arhat Hall and shoulder the training duty. The trainees exchanged guilty looks and braced for what the commitment would bring. The trainees had just argued about the wounded monk when a shout tore through the hall. Someone called out Bayab Gang as a bare-chested figure with scars entered. Mu Jin stepped forward and declared he looked forward to working with them. Two young trainees stammered and exchanged embarrassed looks. The rest murmured and turned to watch him. Close eyes scanned his wounds and steady posture. The senior's earlier assignment still hung over the group. The trainees tightened their stance and braced for the training Mu Jin would now receive among them. The halls had gone quiet after the earlier argument about the wounded monk. A bare-chested, scarred member of Bayab Gang entered and drew every eye. The leader called the trainees to begin morning training, and they rose at once. Mu Jin stood among them and met the newcomer's steady gaze without flinching. A senior voice recited that if they knew the enemy and themselves, they would win every battle. The trainees tightened their stance and prepared for the regimen the senior had assigned. Tension settled as they waited for the first command. The hall had fallen silent after the earlier argument about the wounded monk. A bare-chested, scarred Bayab Gang member stood and drew every eye as the leader ordered morning training. The trainees rose and Mu Jin met the newcomer's gaze without flinching. The scarred man tried a stance and questioned his own method inwardly. A young trainee stepped forward and told him that was not how to do it. The correction cut through the room. Faces tightened as the scarred man watched the trainee's sudden, dark expression. Tension rose and the hall waited for the first command. Silence broke when the scarred Bayab Gang member fixed the newcomer with a cold stare. He spoke a naked threat about taking value from the newcomer's face, and the hall tensed. The young trainee moved instantly and delivered a low, sweeping kick. The scarred man could not recover his footing. He slammed to the floor and rolled away. Heads turned and Mu Jin kept his distance without stepping in. The leader's command remained unsaid as the echo of the fall hung in the room. Silence broke when a scarred Bayab Gang member fixed young trainee with a cold stare and issued a naked threat about taking value from his face. Young trainee moved instantly and delivered a low, sweeping kick that knocked the man off his feet. The Bayab gang member slammed to the floor and rolled away, clutching for balance. Heads turned as onlookers absorbed the fall. Mu Jin kept his distance and did not intervene. The injured man gathered himself, spat, and met young trainee's gaze with a dangerous look. The leader's command remained unspoken as tension hung in the room. Silence broke when a scarred Bayab gang member fixed young trainee with a cold stare. Young trainee replied with a low sweep that toppled the man. The man slammed to the floor, then rolled away, clutching for balance. He spat and rose, meeting the trainee's gaze with a dangerous look. No one intervened. Mu Jin stayed back. A leader barked orders to resume training, and the trainee complied at once. Drills resumed across the hall. Onlookers murmured and wondered what kind of child he was. Silence had broken when a scarred Bayab gang member fixed young trainee with a cold stare. The trainee had answered with a low sweep that toppled the man, who slammed down and rolled away clutching for balance. He spat and rose, face dangerous. No one intervened. Mu Jin kept his distance. A leader barked orders and training resumed. Onlookers exchanged uneasy glances and whispered, baffled by the child. In the hall, senior monks frowned and sweated as they asked aloud what Bayab gang was doing with the kid, unable to explain the boy's calm ferocity. Silence fell after the scarred Bayab gang member glared at the young trainee. The trainee swept him down, and the man rose spitting, face dangerous. Orders restored training under watchful eyes. A title panel named the group and displayed their rules, framing the gang's reputation. A burly enforcer earned the nickname Mad Dog for his relentless style. Monks muttered about the gang's past violence and obsessive methods. Still, the Bayab gang moved unusually restrained and trained amicably beside a strange new monk. The hall kept its distance, uneasy yet forced to accept the odd cooperation. Silence had settled, and the brash Bayab gang disciple spoke about scars and the price of training. He warned the trainee to guard the knees and coached proper stance to prevent damage. The disciple crossed his arms and emphasized a slight knee bend with weight centered. He then demonstrated shifting and locking the legs to absorb impact while the trainee watched and mirrored each motion. Small corrections followed until the trainee executed the stance cleanly. Praise was given and the group resumed controlled drills under a wary calm. Silence fell after the drill. The brash monk told the young trainee to rest and watch. He crossed his arms and spoke about guarding the knees and stance. Then the hall's attention shifted when someone reported a return. The drenched monk lay wounded and drenched on a cot as onlookers gathered. They noted his crushed limbs and fragile breathing and murmured that he had been gone a long time. Senior monks traded grave looks and weighed what had happened. The trainees absorbed the news quietly while the group prepared care. Silence lingered after the drill as the brash monk urged the young trainee to watch and rest. The hall had turned toward the drenched monk who lay motionless on a cot. Senior monks traded grave looks and arranged care while onlookers murmured among themselves. At dawn, a chant rose, and the hall prepared for morning ritual and breakfast. Commands sent trainees moving, lines formed, and someone praised the day's effort. A muscular monk stood apart, and a younger trainee probed him about the methods taught. They noted he had not simply followed orders, but refined technique through practice. The hall watched silently as whispers rose that his techniques were incredible. Silence broke as the muscular monk explained he had practiced almost every day after leaving the temple. Trainees clustered and listened as the brash monk and the young trainee exchanged questions about the origin of his style. Onlookers marveled and called his techniques magnificent, while senior monks remained watchful. Conversation shifted to whether the methods came from the school or elsewhere, and trainees guessed an extraordinary past. The hall cheered briefly. He opened his mouth to answer but paused, and the moment held on that single withheld word. After the held silence, he shrugged and limited his praise to a treatment tip for his knees. Trainees traded brief questions and banter, while the hall relaxed into casual talk about training and dinner. He told them he would note their points and excused himself. Jin confirmed he was finished and asked to leave. They invited one another to eat on Main Street. The mood shifted when two senior voices cleared their throats and snapped attention back. A trainee froze and rushed an apology to the seniors in a tense, trembling voice. After the held silence, he had limited his praise to a knee treatment tip and excused himself. Trainees traded quick questions and easy banter, while the hall relaxed into talk of training and dinner. Two senior voices then cleared throats and snapped attention back, prompting a trembling apology from a frozen trainee. Later, two monks teased one another about sneakers and exposed ankles, and others laughed. A trainee then admitted his knees were in terrible shape from constant training and confessed he had kept silent. He said he avoided worrying the seniors and avoided showing any weak side. After the held silence, he limited praise to a knee treatment tip and left. Trainees bantered about training and dinner. Two senior voices then cleared throats and snapped attention back. A frozen trainee trembled and apologized. Later, he admitted his knees were in terrible shape from constant training and had hidden it to avoid worrying seniors. The group speculated the healer's background, debating whether he came from a lineage of physicians or martial artists. Leaders counseled caution, agreeing not to press him, and decided to let him guide trainees down the correct path. Silence broke when a voice called out and tasked the Bayab gang with responsibility. A bald trainee then screamed and clutched his knees, trembling as he apologized. He admitted his knees had been ruined by constant training and had hidden the pain. The group murmured, speculating whether the healer came from a medical family or a martial lineage. Leaders urged caution and agreed not to press the matter. A senior stepped forward and announced a shift to internal energy training. A robed demonstrator seated and glowed, and the leader ordered trainees to prepare to master their internal energy. After a tense silence, the bald trainee tested his injured knee and steadied himself. He thought back to the postures the senior had taught and readied his breath. The leader instructed everyone to inhale deeply and focus through their nose. The robed demonstrator seated and gathered internal energy until a blue aura coalesced around him. The energy flowed outward into visible currents and lit the hall in cold light. Trainees watched in stunned silence, then erupted into a shout as the method proved real and hope spread among them. After the demonstration, the trainees moved like a single machine. Jin was eager but not alone. Others mirrored his determination. The young trainee and his peers practiced the lung method with brisk jabs and measured breaths. The senior circled and corrected stances while onlookers whispered and nodded. Energy swelled as students repeated the exercise until technique began to show. Then the hall fell quiet. One trainee paused and tilted his head. He felt an odd stillness that did not fit the excitement. The moment hung before training resumed. After the demonstration, the trainees resumed drills with synchronized movement and controlled breathing. The senior observed and corrected while onlookers watched. Then the hall quieted. A young trainee paused and felt an odd stillness. An internal vision of a glowing yin-yang seal appeared before him as he focused on his breath. He counted breaths and felt pressure at his chest. The moment stretched, training slowed. He closed his eyes, sat straighter, and returned to the meditative posture while the others remained attentive. After the meditation, the young trainee's inner vision broadened into a clear sequence. He saw a channel of chi open, then boots, and a blue silhouette descending through a void. Text boxes described a technique to steal another's chi and summon power from the skies. The senior stepped forward and rested a hand on the trainee's shoulder while addressing the hall. Onlookers listened without moving. The trainee's eye briefly shone and he breathed deeper. He settled his posture and met the senior's gaze with quiet resolve. After the meditation, the young trainee's inner vision had shown a chi channel and a descending blue silhouette. The senior rested a hand on the trainee's shoulder and addressed the hall. Onlookers listened without moving. The trainee's eye briefly shone, and he settled his posture with quiet resolve. Later, he opened a folded manual and read its lines aloud while the senior and others watched. The page bore the title Nebrius and defined it as passageways where energy flowed within the body. The text added that both energy and innate forces traveled those channels. The senior asked the young trainee to name the passages and teach them to the hall. The trainee stood and read terms aloud while onlookers listened without movement. He opened the manual titled Nebrius and read its definition of internal passageways. The text described how energy and innate forces traveled those channels through the body. He repeated the lines and stilled his breath to memorize the flow and structure. Later, he stepped outside and considered that individual passages varied in strength and form. His eyes briefly flared as he absorbed the idea. A sudden shout called the name Bayab Gang and drew everyone's attention. The hall returned to training after the shout, and the young trainee stood, exhausted. He complained about his fatigue and focused on steadying his breath and posture. He winced as he heard the senior's joints creak while demonstrating a stance. The trainee reflected that some internal passages strengthened with time and repeated use. He blamed inexperience for his weakness and resolved to train more patiently. The senior watched, rebuked any search for shortcuts, and stressed steady practice. After tension eased, the senior offered a brief practical exercise to the trainee. The trainee accepted and prepared to learn the small technique the senior would teach. The hall returned to training, and the young trainee sat up, breathing hard. He accepted the senior's brief exercise and prepared to learn the small technique. The senior cautioned against shortcuts and watched the trainee steady his posture. While the lesson unfolded, a distant scout moved through a forest and noted faint signs of a camp. Armed men lay in wait, and an ambush erupted as soldiers approached. Arrows and sudden movement shattered the quiet and forced quick reactions. Soldiers leaped to cover and returned controlled fire. The lesson and the skirmish proceeded apart, but with equal tension. The hall returned to training, and the young trainee sat up, breathing hard. He accepted the senior's brief exercise. He prepared to learn the small technique as the senior cautioned against shortcuts and watched posture. A distant scout moved through a wet forest and noted faint camp signs. Armed men lay in wait, and an ambush erupted as soldiers approached. Arrows shattered the quiet, and soldiers leaped to cover, returning controlled fire. One man was forced to retreat and later sat alone in the rain, replaying the withdrawal. He then entered a building where a bald instructor spoke to a young monk over food. Training had resumed, and the young trainee accepted the senior's short instruction on posture and restraint. The senior warned against shortcuts and urged them not to abandon comrades. The trainee listened and tested his stance while others watched. A sharp cry split the hall and drew every eye. A drenched, wounded man stumbled through the entrance, soaked and breathing hard. He addressed the group in a rough voice and tried to explain his delay. The hall fell silent as the monks assessed his wounds, and the trainee steadied himself for orders. Training had resumed, and the hall remained tense after the drenched man stumbled in. Mugung stepped forward and cut across the talk with a hard shout. He berated the late arrival and demanded details while gripping a staff. The drenched monk smirked and answered in a casual tone. He pointed to a nearby spot and offered a sharp suggestion to explain his delay. The hall watched the exchange. The young trainee considered the claim and brightened at the implication. The senior and onlookers stayed alert for the next move. Training had resumed, and the hall stayed tense after the drenched man arrived. Mugung cut the talk with a hard shout and demanded answers. The drenched monk smirked and pointed toward a spot. The young trainee brightened at the implication and moved forward. He sat down, pressed his palm to his knee, and steadied his breath. He declared himself ready to the senior and sank into formal posture. He began to circulate his inner energy, feeling it travel along his arms and chest. The sensation felt real and subtly different than before. The senior and onlookers watched closely for any change. Training resumed while the hall held a taut silence and observers kept watch. The young trainee chose this chance to test himself and pushed inward. He steadied his breath, then circulated his inner energy along his arms and chest. The sensation shifted, and he glimpsed a brief image he had not seen before. The memory matched a detail from his solo practice and sparked a sharp doubt. His eyes widened as recognition came, and he muttered that it must be energy. The senior and onlookers leaned forward and focused on the trainee's next move. The young trainee closed his eyes and matched his breath to the instruction. He breathed out through his mouth and focused on pushing the gathered evil energies outward. His exhalations came sharp and steady as pressure eased from his chest. He then inhaled as deeply as he could. He drew in the pure energy of nature and guided that flow inward. The motion traveled toward his body's center, where his energy core lay. A faint mote of light gathered near that center. The senior and onlookers leaned forward and watched the trainee's next motion. Young trainee closed his eyes and matched his breath to the instruction. He exhaled and forced gathered evil energy outward until pressure eased from his chest. He inhaled deeply and drew nature's pure energy inward toward his center. A faint mote of light gathered near his energy core and pulsed. Senior and onlookers leaned forward to watch his next motion. The trainee recognized a difference between himself and Bayab Gang in that instant. He whispered that he had done it and felt a thin stream of energy. His excitement faltered when the current proved small and fleeting. He wondered whether belief alone limited his power. Young trainee closed his eyes and matched his breath to the instructor's pace. He exhaled and pushed gathered dark pressure outward until his chest eased. He inhaled and drew nature's pure energy inward toward his center. A faint mote of light formed near his core and pulsed. Senior and onlookers leaned forward and watched the motion closely. The trainee noticed a difference from Bayab Gang and whispered that he had succeeded. The current remained thin and fleeting, and his excitement quickly cooled. He wondered whether belief alone limited his power. The mote then gathered and multiplied into steady golden motes around him. Energy wrapped the trainee, and the hall fell quiet with tense attention. Young trainee had matched his breath and pushed pressure outward until his chest eased. He drew energy inward, and a faint mote formed near his core. The mote gathered and multiplied into steady golden motes that wrapped him and quieted the hall. Senior and onlookers leaned forward with tense attention. The trainee then felt a sudden chill and wondered whether belief alone limited his power. Senior asked how much time had passed and chastised the trainee for losing track. The trainee apologized, attempted a nervous smile, and offered a joking remark to break the tension. The trainee had matched his breath and drawn a faint golden mote near his core, and the hall had quieted as senior and onlookers leaned forward. A brash disciple ordered late students to leave, and the trainee silently vowed to earn respect. Dawn rose over the temple, and his private vow became a loud oath that pulled eyes. Footsteps approached the courtyard, and a senior cut him off with a sharp reprimand for wandering. The trainee met the senior's stare without flinching, resolve steady even as doubt lingered at the edge of his focus. The trainee matched his breath and drew a faint golden mote near his core. The hall fell silent as senior and onlookers leaned forward. A brash disciple dismissed the late students and left the courtyard. The trainee kept his private vow and felt it harden into resolve. Dawn rose and the vow pulled many eyes toward him. Footsteps approached and Senior stepped between the trainee and the path. Senior issued a sharp reprimand for wandering and demanded answers. The trainee met Senior's stare without flinching, resolve still steady. Senior then produced a roster and displayed it to the gathered trainees. He called them to line up for inspection and recited the rules. Murmurs rustled among the ranks as the trainees obeyed. Young trainee drew a faint golden mote near his core and steadied his breath. The hall fell silent as senior and onlookers leaned forward. A brash monk dismissed the late students and left the courtyard. Footsteps approached. Senior stepped between young trainee and the path and demanded answers. He produced a roster, displayed it, and ordered the trainees to line up. Murmurs rustled among the ranks as the trainees obeyed. Young trainee met senior's stare without flinching. His private vow hardened into resolve at dawn. After senior ordered the trainees to line up, young trainee sat and focused on his core. He drew a faint golden mote near his abdomen and steadied his breath. He announced his intent and began energy circulation with deliberate control. Warm light traced his limbs as he practiced stances and moved through patterns. Onlookers quieted and leaned forward to watch. Two nearby trainees approached and mocked his display. Young trainee met their scorn with a hard, unblinking stare and remained silent. His private vow at dawn hardened into a steady resolve. Young trainee crouched beside a wounded monk and checked his breathing and pulse. He noticed crimson staining the monk's robe and probed the injury with careful hands. A brash disciple asked a sharp question and mocked the effort. The trainee remained focused, tested the man's limb, and found a bone clearly out of place. Onlookers leaned forward and fell silent. He steadied his breath and prepared to set the displaced bone despite the mocking tone in the hall. Young trainee crouched beside the wounded monk and checked his breathing and pulse. He noticed crimson staining the robe and probed the wound with careful hands. He steadied the limb and confirmed a bone was clearly out of place. He prepared to set it despite a brash disciple's mocking tone. A plaque read MUHYUNG, and the sight pulled a jagged memory forward. The memory flashed red with violent motion and blows. Onlookers murmured and leaned closer. Two trainees whispered, and one finally asked why the monk had been beaten. Young trainee had crouched beside the wounded monk and checked his breathing and pulse. He probed the stained robe and confirmed a bone was clearly out of place. A brash disciple mocked nearby while onlookers murmured and leaned closer. Two trainees whispered, and one asked why the monk had been beaten. They offered guesses and blamed a staff strike without evidence. Then one trainee's eyes widened and recognition cut across his face. His pulse thudded and he excused himself as he moved to the threshold. Another trainee called after him and the hall filled with sudden tension. Young trainee crouched beside the wounded monk and checked his breathing and pulse. He probed the stained robe and confirmed a bone protruded from the limb. A brash disciple mocked as onlookers leaned closer and whispered guesses, blaming a staff strike without proof. One trainee's face changed with recognition and he excused himself, moving to the threshold. The hall tightened around that motion. A senior monk stood nearby silent, watching the stumbling trainees approach. A voice broke the hush and demanded, seriously, what happened? The panel ended on that question. Young trainee had crouched beside the wounded monk and confirmed a protruding bone. Other trainees huddled and whispered, blaming a staff strike without any proof. Conversation drifted to Mu Gung when one trainee recognized the name and stood. A brash monk taunted as onlookers leaned closer and tension built around them. One trainee tugged another's sleeve and urged him to go confront Mu Gung. He shoved to push him forward, and the pushed trainee crashed onto the ground. Silence followed the crash, then a nervous laugh and an awkward apology. Young trainee crouched beside the wounded monk and confirmed a protruding bone. Other trainees huddled and whispered accusations that a staff strike had caused it. Conversation turned to Mu Gung, and one trainee rose to confront the name. A brash monk taunted, while onlookers leaned closer and tension tightened around them. Someone shoved another trainee, and the pushed man crashed onto the ground. A voice snapped and demanded whether they had just ended the wounded monk. One trainee scolded them for wasting their precious training time and stepped forward. A younger trainee interposed and asked if the others considered him their junior. Silence followed as each man measured the other, and the scene froze. Young trainee crouched beside the wounded monk and confirmed a protruding bone. Trainees accused a staff strike and invoked Mu Gung by name. A brash monk taunted, while onlookers leaned in and tension tightened. A shove sent a man crashing to the ground, and a voice demanded whether they had ended the wounded monk. One trainee scolded them for wasting training and stepped forward. The younger trainee interposed and asked if others considered him their junior. Silence followed as each man measured the other, and the scene froze. The standoff broke when the brash monk lunged. Young trainee countered, grappled, and executed a twisting throw that slammed the attacker down. Onlookers fell silent as a jeer mocked the fallen man. Young trainee crouched beside the wounded monk and confirmed the injury. Trainees blamed a staff strike and named Mu Gung while a brash monk taunted the wounded man. A shove toppled a bystander, and voices demanded whether the man had been finished. The younger trainee scolded them, and a challenge about seniority held the room in silence. The brash monk lunged. Young trainee met him, grappled, and executed a twisting throw that smashed the attacker to the floor. Onlookers jeered. Young trainee then studied the fallen man's balance and breathing, concluded the opponent lacked center, and walked away with another monk trailing behind. After the scuffle, the hall filled with jeers and low voices. Disciples circled the wounded monk and accused Mu Gung of striking him. The brash monk taunted the fallen man and pushed a bystander aside. A small boy and an older man stood at the doorway watching. Young trainee studied the man's breathing, then rose without ceremony. Others debated the man's fate and agreed he could not continue training. Two monks lifted the wounded man and carried him toward the infirmary. Young trainee followed at a measured pace while the hall watched in uneasy silence. After the scuffle, the hall grew loud with jeers and low voices. Disciples crowded the wounded man and blamed Mu Gung for the blow. The brash monk shoved a bystander and taunted the fallen man openly, while a small boy and an older man watched from the doorway. Young trainee checked the wounded man's breathing, then rose without ceremony as others argued his fate. Two monks lifted the injured man and began toward the infirmary, while young trainee followed at a measured pace. In the corridor, the brash monk accused the trainee of failing to protect the injured and demanded action. Pressured by peers, the trainee hesitated, then set his jaw and resolved to try. The injured had been carried toward the infirmary, while the trainee followed at a measured pace. Outside the courtyard, 3 monks watched the yard under the sun. Mu Hyung suddenly doubled over and pressed his hand to his brow. He sank to the ground and rubbed his temple, confused by a sudden ache and a memory gap. The surrounding disciples quieted and began to whisper among themselves. The brash monk and others fixed the trainee with accusing looks and stepped closer. Pressure mounted on the trainee as the crowd's expressions hardened into silent threats, forcing him to brace and prepare. The injured had been carried toward the infirmary, while the trainee followed at a measured pace. Outside the courtyard, 3 monks watched under the sun. Mu Hyung suddenly doubled over and pressed his hand to his brow. He sank and rubbed his temple as a sharp ache and a hole in his memory troubled him. The surrounding disciples quieted and exchanged whispers. The brash monk and others closed in with accusing stares and pressure mounted on the trainee. Mu Hyung's thoughts fractured into disjointed phrases. A nearby young trainee called out and checked on him. Mu Hyung forced a weak reassurance and sat up. The injured had been carried toward the infirmary, while the trainee followed at a measured pace. 3 monks stood in the courtyard under the sun as Mu Hyung doubled over with a sharp ache and memory gap. The surrounding disciples hushed and eyed the trainee. Mu Hyung steadied himself and sat up with weak reassurance. The brash monk then boasted and taunted the gathered trainees. A young trainee looked terrified, while a drenched monk showed bruises and worn transfers would be denied. The scene cut to a titled sequence, Origin, where caption boxes began an outsider's account of harsh recruitment. The injured were carried to the infirmary, while the trainees stood silent and watchful. Everyone realized why Mu Jin had spoken and what his words intended to accomplish. Most trainees accepted the harsh plan without protest, only one refused to relent. A brash monk mocked the doubters, while a drenched monk recounted past injuries. Mu Jin then described a brutal lesson meant to break illusions and forge strength. At sunset, he asked for volunteers to test themselves through a demanding trial.